The Meters 2 Browning is a heavy machine gun built around a single cartridge. It weighs about 84 pounds without its mount. Its barrel runs roughly 45 inches, and it throws a half-inch bullet near 2,900 feet per second. Yet, it was not built for the man walking into an infantry assault. It was built to kill machines. Anti-aircraft crews scanned for armored aircraft the rifle could not reach. Tank crews needed a round that pierced steel. Naval mounts swept low across the water. Coastal batteries waited for the thing the smaller guns could not touch. A requirement written in the last weeks of one war became a program of the next. Factories turned out close to 2 million guns of every model. Refrigerator lines and car parts plants built them by the 100,000. The gun did not stay where it was assigned. It moved onto jeeps, ship's rails, and convoy trucks. It ended up on a tripod behind a Marine, aimed at a man 2,000 yards away. That reach cost weight, a crew, and a setup ritual that could detonate the gun in a gunner's hands. Every advantage the bullet bought was paid for somewhere behind it. It was neither a cannon nor a rifle. It occupied the space between them, and that space never closed. A rifle handled a man. A cannon handled a fortress. Between those two extremes lay a whole class of targets that neither weapon served well. The aircraft, the truck, the boat, the bunker wall, the machine gun nest at a distance no rifleman could answer. The 50 was built to fill part of that gap, and it kept filling more of it than anyone intended. Its designers specified an anti-aircraft and anti-armor weapon. Its soldiers discovered that its real value was reach and destructive power against everything in the middle. The gun outlived the targets it was built to kill. The airplane grew too fast for it. The tank grew too thick for it. Both of its assigned jobs slipped away within a single generation, and still the gun did not leave. That is the puzzle at the center of its long life. How does a weapon built to kill one thing survive by killing everything else? The answer runs through more than 100 years. It begins on an armistice-era test range, where a prototype fired too slow and too weak. It runs through a 15-year delay and a designer's death, through appliance factories and fighter wings, through frozen Korean perimeters and Vietnamese convoy roads, through desert gun trucks and a 100-year-old receiver still bolted to a modern turret. Along the way, nearly every popular story about the gun bends the record a little. The straight version is stranger than the myths. It is the story of a bullet that arrived before the gun, a gun that arrived after its own inventor, and a weapon that answered a need no one has yet found a better way to meet. Chapter 1. The bullet that came before the gun. By 1918, the rifle-caliber machine gun had met two enemies it could not touch. One flew, and one wore steel. The American Expeditionary Force in France had machine guns in plenty, most of them chambered for the standard .30 caliber cartridge. Against infantry in the open, that cartridge did its work. Against an aircraft armored around the engine and the pilot, and against the first battlefield tanks, the .30 caliber bullet lost its authority. It struck, and it failed to penetrate. The gap was not a matter of aim. It was a matter of energy, and no amount of skill behind a .30 caliber gun could add the energy the target demanded. The war had changed shape faster than the weapons could follow. Tanks had rolled across the trench lines from the middle of the war onward, slow and mechanical and, at first, thinly plated, but proof against rifle fire and against the machine guns meant to stop infantry. Aircraft had begun the war as unarmored observation platforms and had grown into fighting machines, some of them plated around the pilot and the engine to survive ground fire. A machine gun that could drop a running man at hundreds of yards would rattle harmlessly off both. The battlefield had produced two armored targets at once, and the standard gun had an answer for neither. The soldiers in the line could see the problem in front of them. The rounds arrived, and the machines kept coming. General John J. Pershing set the terms of the answer. He asked the Army Ordnance Department for a machine gun of at least half-inch caliber, firing a bullet at a muzzle velocity of no less than 2,700 feet per second. Those two numbers defined the whole problem. Caliber gave the bullet mass. Velocity gave it speed. Together, they gave it the energy to reach through armor plate that turned the smaller round aside. Everything the gun would later become began as those two figures on a requirement. The half-inch bore was not a round figure chosen for neatness. It was the smallest caliber the ordnance men believed could carry enough metal fast enough to matter against armor, and the velocity was set by the same logic, high enough to keep that energy alive out to the ranges where aircraft and tanks were engaged. The first attempts reached for a shortcut. Colonel John Henry Parker had watched French gunners fire an 11mm incendiary round, and it seemed a promising starting point. The Ordnance Department ordered 8 experimental Colt machine guns rechambered for the French cartridge. The result fell short. The 11mm round did not carry the velocity the requirement named, and a gun built around it would have inherited that weakness permanently. The shortcut closed. A new cartridge would have to be designed from the ground up, and a new gun would have to be built around it. The lesson of the failed 11mm was blunt. A powerful gun could not be improvised from an existing round that fell short on speed, because velocity was not a detail to be added later. It was the property the whole design had to be built to deliver. The reference point came from the enemy. German engineers had already fielded a heavy anti-tank cartridge, a 13mm round meant to defeat armor at range, and they had built a long anti-tank rifle to fire it, a single-shot shoulder weapon that a soldier braced and fired at tanks across no man's land. Captured examples told American designers exactly what a working solution looked like. The German round drove an 800-grain bullet at roughly 2,700 feet per second, and it could punch through about an inch of armor at 250 yards. That performance became the target to match. The American cartridge would not copy the German case, but it would have to equal what the German case could do. The enemy had, in effect, written the specification in steel, and the Americans read it off the captured ammunition and the captured rifle. The requirement was really about a class of targets, not two named ones. Pershing had asked for a gun to kill aircraft and tanks, but underneath those two names lay a broader truth about the modern battlefield. War was filling with machines, and machines were harder to kill than men. An observation balloon hung in the sky, protected where it mattered. A staff car carried commanders down a road. A field gun sat behind a shield of plate. Each of these was a target the rifle-caliber gun could reach but not always defeat, and each demanded more energy than the 30-caliber round could carry. The half-inch requirement answered the two most urgent of those targets, the aircraft and the tank, but the need it named was wider than either. That is why the gun would find so much work later that no one specified in 1918. The requirement solved for two machines and, without meaning to, described a whole category of them. The men who wrote it were thinking of the plane overhead and the tank across the wire. The weapon they called for would prove useful against nearly everything mechanical that a rifle could not stop, a category the 20th century would only enlarge. The man who set the numbers understood their price. A half-inch bullet weighs many times what a 30-caliber bullet weighs. Driving it to 2,700 feet per second demands a large charge of powder, and that charge drives the gun backward as hard as it drives the bullet forward. A weapon strong enough to contain that pressure and absorb that recoil could not be a light thing. It would be heavy. It would need a substantial mount to stay on target. It would ask for more than one man to carry and serve it. The reach Pershing wanted was real, and so was the weight that came with it. The requirement promised a bullet that could touch what the rifle could not, and it guaranteed a gun no single soldier could shoulder. That trade was visible before the first prototype existed. On paper, the advantage was pure. A round that pierced armor at range would answer the aircraft and the tank in one stroke. In practice, every inch of caliber and every foot per second of velocity was paid for in pounds, in recoil, in crew, and in the size of the tripod that would hold the whole thing steady. The bigger bullet solved the energy problem and created a portability problem in the same motion. That pattern would repeat for the rest of the gun's life. It would always be able to reach farther and hit harder than the weapons around it, and it would always weigh more, need more hands, and demand more setup than the weapons around it. The requirement existed on paper by the autumn of 1918. The cartridge had a benchmark to meet. What did not yet exist was the gun, and the war that had produced the requirement had only weeks left to run. Someone still had to build the weapon, and the clock that had created the urgency was about to stop. Chapter 2. 13 months on a dead war's clock. John Browning had already built America's machine guns. He had never built one this large, and the war that demanded it was about to end. Browning's water-cooled 30-caliber gun was the standard the Army trusted, and his design language was the natural starting point for something bigger. Around the middle of 1917, he began the work of scaling his existing gun upward, enlarging the mechanism to handle a cartridge many times more powerful than the one it was built for. Winchester took on the cartridge itself, developing a half-inch round as an enlarged relative of the standard 30-caliber service cartridge. The two problems, the gun and the ammunition, advanced together, because neither could be finished without the other. Scaling a design is not the same as copying it larger. A mechanism that works at 30 caliber does not simply grow to half-inch and keep working, because the forces do not scale evenly. The pressure rose, the recoiling mass rose, the energy the gun had to absorb on every shot rose, and every part that had been adequate in the smaller gun had to be reconsidered against a cartridge that hit far harder. Browning's task was to keep the logic of a proven action while rebuilding it to survive a round several times more powerful. That is why the work took the shape of a redesign rather than an enlargement, and why the cartridge and the gun had to be developed in step. A change to the round changed the forces, and a change to the forces changed the gun. Pershing shaped the design from a distance through a single insistence. The cartridge, he directed, would be rimless rather than rimmed. A rimmed case, with a lip at its base, feeds awkwardly in a belt-fed automatic weapon, because each round must be pulled backward out of the belt before it can be chambered. A rimless case, with a groove cut into a base of full diameter, can be pushed straight forward into the chamber. For a gun meant to fire hundreds of rounds a minute from a long belt, that difference touched reliability at its root. The instruction added work in the near term and removed failures in the long term. It is one of the quiet reasons the finished gun fed as smoothly as it did. A rimmed round would have forced the mechanism to make an extra motion, pulling each cartridge back before pushing it forward, and every extra motion in an automatic weapon is another place for the cycle to fail under dirt and heat. The recoil of the new cartridge forced an innovation of its own. Browning's earlier guns absorbed their recoil with a stack of fiber discs that compressed under the shock of firing. The half-inch round hit far harder than the discs were meant to handle. Working with the engineer Fred T. Moore, Browning turned to a hydraulic buffer, a fluid-filled component that soaked up the blow of the recoiling parts and returned them smoothly. The buffer tamed a recoil impulse that would have battered a simpler mechanism to pieces. It also added a part that had to be maintained, filled, and kept sound. The gun that resulted was more capable and less simple than the guns that came before it, and that exchange, more capability bought with more complexity, would follow the design forward. The buffer did more than protect the gun from itself. By controlling how the recoiling parts stopped and returned, it governed the rhythm of the whole action, the rate at which the gun cycled, and the smoothness with which it did so. A recoil the fiber discs could not have survived became, through the buffer, a controlled and repeatable stroke. That control is part of why the mature gun could fire long strings without shaking itself apart. It is also a reason the gun demanded upkeep the smaller weapons did not. A fluid-filled component that soaks up the force of a half-inch cartridge is a component that can leak, foul, or fall out of adjustment, and a gun that depends on it depends on the crew keeping it sound. Colt stood behind the manufacturing from the start, as it had for Browning's earlier guns. The arrangement that had carried the .30 caliber weapons into service. A designer working through an established maker carried the half-inch gun through its first prototypes and trials. Browning supplied the design and the judgment. Colt supplied the shop, the machinists, and the experience of turning a drawing into a working gun. That partnership mattered because a machine gun is not proven on paper. It is proven on a range, round after round, with parts remade and refitted until the mechanism runs. The early half-inch guns were built and rebuilt in small numbers. Each trial feeding changes back into the next, in the slow iteration that turns a promising mechanism into a dependable one. None of it moved fast, because after the armistice, nothing had to. The gun advanced at the pace of a peacetime program, a few weapons at a time, tested and adjusted by men who had all the time the shrinking budgets would give them and no enemy pressing them to hurry. The first firing trials came on the 15th of October, 1918. The prototype ran, and it disappointed. It fired at under 500 rounds a minute, slower than a heavy gun of its class needed. Its muzzle velocity reached only about 2,300 feet per second, well short of the 2,700 the requirement named. At that speed, the round could not deliver the armor penetration that was the entire reason for its existence. The gun that was meant to defeat aircraft and tanks could not yet defeat the armor plate set up to test it. The design worked as a machine. It did not yet work as a weapon. The gap between those two things, a mechanism that cycles and a weapon that performs, was the gap the next 15 years would have to close. Weeks later, the war ended. The armistice of November 1918 removed the pressure that had driven the whole effort. A requirement born of combat urgency now belonged to a peacetime army with shrinking budgets and no immediate enemy. The velocity problem still had a solution, and the captured German ammunition pointed to it. Matching the German round's performance, Winchester pushed the American cartridge upward until it reached roughly 2,750 feet per second, past the figure Pershing had demanded. The bullet had finally caught up to the requirement. The gun around it, though, no longer had a war to hurry it, and a finished weapon without a war moves slowly. Here, the popular story of the gun begins to bend, and it is worth correcting early. The weapon is remembered as one man's invention, the product of a single genius named Browning. The core of that memory is fair. The mechanism was his, the scaling was his, and the design instincts that made it work were his. But the gun was never the work of one man alone. Winchester built the cartridge that gave it meaning. Fred T. Moore helped solve the recoil that would have destroyed it. Pershing's insistence on a rimless case shaped how it fed. The Ordnance Department set the standard it had to meet. The single inventor story feels true because Browning's contribution was real and central, and because a single name is easier to carry than a list of them. The record shows a weapon that took a cartridge maker, an engineer, an army bureaucracy, and years of refinement to become itself. The war ended before the gun was finished, and a finished gun with no war is a slow thing to complete. The half-inch Browning would not reach its mature form for another decade and a half. Between the armistice and the gun that fought the next war stood 15 years of quiet development, a change of designers, and a funeral. Chapter 3. The gun that arrived 15 years late. The half-inch Browning that fought the Second World War was not finished by the man whose name it carried. He was dead before it existed in its mature form. What the 1920s produced first was an interim weapon, the water-cooled model of 1921. It followed the pattern of Browning's .30 caliber gun closely, wrapping the barrel in a jacket of water to carry away the heat of sustained fire. Both the Army and the Navy adopted it. Its weight decided how it would be used. At roughly 121 pounds, it was too heavy to maneuver as a field weapon, so it served mostly where it could stay put: fixed anti-aircraft positions, coastal mounts, and other static roles where a gun did not have to move. The water jacket was not a flaw. It was the best answer anyone had, at the time, to a real problem. A gun firing a powerful cartridge in long bursts builds heat fast enough to ruin a barrel, and surrounding that barrel with water carried the heat away and let the gun keep firing. The Navy, whose ships had weight to spare and fixed mounts to fill, had little reason to object to a heavy, water-cooled gun standing guard against aircraft. The problem was the field army, which needed a gun it could move. A weapon that had to carry a reservoir of water into action and keep that reservoir filled was a weapon tied to a prepared position. It could defend a fixed point superbly. It could not follow a moving fight. The model served through the years between the wars in modest numbers, tested and refined rather than mass-produced. An improved version, around 1930, trimmed the weapon and refined it. Stripped of its cooling water, it weighed near 79 pounds and measured about 56 inches long, and it fired in the range of 500 to 600 rounds a minute. It was a better gun than the 1921. It was still, in its bones, a design waiting to be reorganized. The water jacket that cooled it also tied it down. A gun that must carry its own reservoir of water is a gun built to hold a position, not to ride into one. For the weapon to become what the next war would need, it had to shed the water and find another way to survive its own heat. The man who reorganized it was not Browning. John Browning died in 1926, before the gun reached its final shape. The work of turning his design into a flexible system fell to an ordnance engineer, S.H. Green, who studied the weapon's problems across the years from 1927 to 1932. Green's insight was structural rather than mechanical. Instead of designing a series of separate guns for separate jobs, he redesigned the basic receiver so that one core could be built into many configurations. From that single receiver, the weapon could be assembled as water-cooled or air-cooled, as a fixed gun or a flexible one, for aircraft or for the ground. One design could become 7 guns. Consider what that meant for the men who would have to build and supply the weapon. 7 separate guns would have meant 7 sets of tooling, 7 training courses, 7 chains of spare parts, 7 of everything. Green's single receiver collapsed that into one core with a family of fittings. A factory that could build the receiver could build any of the variants by finishing it differently. A soldier who knew one version understood the others. A supply officer stocking parts for the ground gun was stocking parts that carried over to the aircraft gun. The reorganization was not a change to how the gun fired. It was a change to how the gun could be manufactured, taught, and maintained. And that change is what made everything after it possible. That idea is the reason the weapon spread as far as it did. A single receiver that could be finished in 7 forms meant that factories could tool up for one core and produce a whole family of weapons from it. It meant that parts and knowledge carried across variants. It meant that the anti-aircraft gun, the aircraft gun, the vehicle gun, and the infantry gun were all, underneath, the same machine. Colt built prototypes of the reorganized design, and manufacture of the model designated the Meters II began in 1933. The gun that would serve for the rest of the century had finally arrived, 15 years after the requirement that called for it. The mount mattered as much as the gun. A weapon that recoiled with the force of the half-inch cartridge needed something solid beneath it, and the ground version rode a heavy tripod built to hold it steady and let it traverse and elevate under control. That tripod alone weighed over 40 pounds, a burden in its own right, but it was what turned a powerful gun into an accurate one. Without a stable mount, the recoil that the buffer tamed inside the gun would still have thrown the aim off between bursts. On vehicles, the same gun sat in ring mounts and pintle mounts and turret cradles, each built to absorb the recoil and carry the weight. The gun was only ever half of the system. The other half was whatever held it down. That is a reason the weapon spread so readily onto trucks, tanks, ships, and aircraft. A single receiver that could be bolted to any mount strong enough to take it fit 100 different machines, each supplying the steadiness the cartridge demanded. The gun brought the firepower. The mount brought the control, and between them they made a weapon that could be placed almost anywhere there was structure to bear it. The version that mattered most for the ground war was the heavy barrel Meters II, built without a water jacket at all. Removing the water solved the portability problem and created a heat problem in its place. A gun that fires a powerful cartridge in long bursts generates enormous heat in its barrel, and the water jacket had existed precisely to carry that heat away. The heavy barrel answered the loss with mass. A thick, heavy barrel could absorb and shed more heat on its own than a thin one, buying the gunner sustained fire without a reservoir of water. At about 84 pounds for the gun, it was heavy, but it was a weight that could be moved, mounted on a vehicle, or carried by a crew to a new position. The water-cooled gun held ground. The heavy barrel gun could go where the ground was contested. The trade in that barrel was plain. Mass bought cooling without water, and mass was weight, and the air-cooled barrel could still overheat under fire long enough and heavy enough. A barrel that grows too hot loses accuracy and, eventually, life. And a barrel fired past its limit could be ruined or could cook a chambered round until it fired on its own. The heavy barrel design pushed that limit back without erasing it. It gave the gun freedom of movement at the cost of a barrel that had to be watched, and, in time, changed. That single decision, water gone and mass added, is what made the weapon a field gun instead of a fortress gun, and it set up the next century of its use. The gun could now follow the fighting. What it could do once it got there depended on a mechanism most of the men who fired it never saw work. Chapter 4. One cycle, locked and broken. The half-inch Browning does not spray. It performs the same violent, exact sequence several hundred times a minute, and every round travels the same path through the same steps. Understanding the gun means following one round through that path from start to finish, because the reliability of the weapon is known for lives in the sequence, not in any single part. The gun works on the principle of short recoil. At the instant of firing, the barrel and the bolt are locked together as one unit. The cartridge sits fully chambered, the breech closed behind it, and the bolt and barrel joined so that nothing can open while pressure is high. When the round fires, the whole locked assembly, barrel and bolt together, is driven rearward by recoil. It travels only a short distance in that locked state, long enough for the bullet to leave the muzzle and the dangerous pressure in the chamber to fall. That short locked travel is the safety at the heart of the design. The breech does not open while the chamber is full of high-pressure gas. It opens only after the bullet is gone and the pressure has dropped. The unlocking is the work of a single moving part. A locking block, a wedge that slides vertically, holds the bolt and the barrel extension together during the locked travel. As the assembly reaches the end of that short rearward movement, the block is driven downward, dropping out of engagement and freeing the bolt from the barrel. The barrel, having done its part, is stopped and begins to return forward. The bolt, now released, continues rearward on its own, carrying the empty case with it. In that separation lies the whole logic of the action. Two parts move as one, while it is dangerous to be apart, then part company the moment it is safe to do so. The bolt does not travel rearward on momentum alone. The gun uses an accelerator, a component that catches energy from the recoiling barrel and slings the bolt backward faster than it would otherwise move. That extra speed matters. It drives extraction and ejection with authority, throws the spent case clear, and sends the bolt far enough back to strip and chamber the next round on its return. The accelerator is one of the details that separates a mechanism that merely functions from one that functions under dirt, heat, and hard use. It puts force into the cycle at the point where force is most needed, taking energy from the heavy barrel as it stops and spending it on the bolt as it starts. Feeding is its own small mechanism inside the larger one, and it runs on the motion the bolt is already making. The gun feeds from a belt of linked rounds, each cartridge held in a metal link that lets go as the round is stripped from it, so the belt disintegrates into loose links as it is consumed and leaves nothing to gather or rewind. As the bolt moves, it works a feed slide that drags the belt across the gun, bringing the next round into line with the chamber. A pawl holds the belt against slipping back while the slide resets for the next pull. Because a rimless case cannot simply be pushed backward out of its link and then forward, the gun lifts and positions each round so the bolt can carry it straight into the chamber on the forward stroke. Every part of that dance is timed to the bolt's travel, so that the belt advances, the round aligns, and the chamber opens all in the same fraction of a second. The feed can be arranged to draw the belt from either side, left or right, and switching it is a matter of rearranging a few parts rather than replacing the gun. That flexibility mattered enormously once the weapon was mounted on vehicles and aircraft, where the ammunition might have to come from whichever side there was room for. A gun in a cramped turret, a gun paired with another beside it, a gun fed from a box bolted where the vehicle allowed, all could be set to take their belts from the convenient side. The same core became a left-feeding gun or a right-feeding gun on demand. One more way the single design bent to fit 100 mounts. The bolt strips a fresh round. The return spring drives everything forward. The round chambers, the barrel and bolt lock together again, and the gun is ready to repeat the sequence. At a cyclic rate in the range of 450 to 600 rounds a minute for the ground gun, that entire sequence happens between 8 and 10 times every second. The gunner feels none of the individual steps. His thumbs press a trigger set between the two spade grips at the rear of the gun, and the whole weapon shoves back against its buffer as the cycle runs. The muzzle velocity, near 2,750 to 2,900 feet per second depending on the load, sends each half-inch bullet out flat and fast, carrying energy far enough to make the gun effective well past 1,000 yards and dangerous for miles beyond that. The extreme reach of the round is not a figure of speech. Fired for maximum distance, the bullet can travel more than 4 miles before it falls, and that long, flat flight is exactly what would later make the gun something more than a machine gun. What reaches the target is the end of a chain that began with a locked barrel and a wedge of steel sliding down at exactly the right moment. One more control sat at the very back of the gun, and it governed the gun's rhythm. Inside the backplate, an oil-filled buffer received the recoiling parts at the end of their travel and returned them, and the way it was set determined how fast the gun cycled. A crew could influence the rate of fire by how that buffer was adjusted, tuning the weapon a little faster or slower within its range. The gun fired from a closed bolt, meaning a round sat chambered and ready before the trigger was pressed, which helped accuracy but carried its own hazard. A barrel heated by long firing could grow hot enough to ignite a chambered round without the trigger, a cook-off, one more reason crews watched their barrels and their rate. The same design also allowed single shots. By managing the trigger and the mechanism, a gunner could fire the weapon one round at a time, a capability that seemed minor in a machine gun and would matter enormously when the gun became a precision weapon at long range. The machine that threw hundreds of rounds a minute could, when a steady hand demanded it, be made to fire exactly one. The strength of short recoil is what made the gun able to handle its cartridge at all. A design that tapped gas from the barrel to work the action, as many later guns do, would have faced the full fury of the half-inch round through a small port and a driven piston, and building that to last would have been its own hard problem. Locking the barrel and bolt together and letting the whole assembly recoil spread the load differently and let the gun digest a punishing cartridge for decades. But the strength came with a condition. Because the barrel itself moves on every shot, and because the bolt must meet the barrel at precisely the right relationship when it locks, the fit between them cannot be left to chance. It has to be set. And on the original gun, it had to be set by hand. That hand setting was not a minor convenience of maintenance. Done wrong, it could fire a round before the breech was fully closed. The same mechanism that made the gun strong enough to fire the cartridge made it capable, if misadjusted, of firing that cartridge in the open. The next part of the gun's story is the ritual that stood between the soldier and that danger. Chapter 5. The ritual that could kill the gunner. Every half-inch gunner learned 2 words before he learned to shoot well: headspace and timing. They named the 2 adjustments that made the gun safe to fire, and they had to be set by the man behind the gun, correctly, every time the weapon was assembled. They were not abstractions. They were the difference between a gun that fired as designed and a gun that came apart in a gunner's hands. Headspace is the distance between the face of the bolt and the base of the chambered cartridge. Set correctly, the bolt closes fully against the round, supporting the case as it fires. Set too loose, the case is left unsupported at the instant of firing, and the pressure inside can rupture it. Timing is the companion adjustment. It governs the point in the recoil cycle at which the gun is allowed to fire, ensuring the weapon fires only when the recoiling parts have returned fully forward and locked. Headspace concerns where the bolt sits. Timing concerns when the gun is permitted to fire. Both had to be right, and on the original gun, both were the gunner's responsibility. The setting was a hands-on procedure, done by feel and by gauge rather than by instinct. The gunner screwed the barrel into the barrel extension and then backed it off a precise amount, counting notches, to place the bolt face at the right distance from the cartridge base. He checked the result with a gauge that told him whether the space was too tight, too loose, or correct. Then he set the timing, adjusting the point at which the gun would fire and confirming it with a second pair of gauges, one that should allow the gun to fire and one that should not. Only when the fire gauge let it fire and the no-fire gauge held it silent was the gun correctly timed. The whole sequence took a trained crewman a couple of minutes, and it had to be repeated whenever the barrel was changed or the gun reassembled. They were adjustable by design because the ammunition demanded it. A gun, fed from cartridges made by many manufacturers, to tolerances that varied from lot to lot and factory to factory, could not rely on every round being identical. Making headspace and timing adjustable let one gun accommodate the small differences between one batch of ammunition and the next. The same flexibility that let the weapon eat ammunition from dozens of sources also handed the gunner a task he could get wrong. If he set the headspace too loose and the timing off, the gun could fire a round that was not fully chambered and locked, an event known as firing out of battery. The result was an uncontained detonation, the cartridge letting go without the breech closed around it, directed back toward the man serving the gun. Browning understood the stakes and tried to engineer the danger down. The gun was issued with a combined gauge, a simple go and no-go tool that let the gunner check headspace and timing by feel and fit rather than by judgment alone. The intent was to make the check as close to foolproof as a field procedure could be, a way for a tired soldier under pressure to confirm the settings without fine measurement. The gauge helped. It did not make the danger disappear. The very existence of a dedicated tool and the drilled insistence that crews use it testify to how real the hazard was. A procedure that risks nothing does not get its own gauge and its own place in every gunner's training. Popular accounts sometimes describe the check as made foolproof, a thing no soldier could get wrong. That claim requires restraint. The tool made the check easier and safer. It never made a careless or hurried gunner immune to the consequences of skipping it. The task also shaped who could use the weapon. This was not a gun a lone rifleman picked up and fired. The heavy barrel gun weighed about 84 pounds, and its tripod added roughly another 44, for a system near 128 pounds carried as separate loads. Moving it, mounting it, and setting it up was work for a crew, and setting headspace and timing correctly was part of bringing it into action. The reach and power the gun offered came bundled with a trained team and a safety ritual. A soldier could carry a rifle and fire it alone in seconds. Bringing the half-inch gun into action meant a crew, an assembly, a gauge, and a check that could not be skipped. The weight was not a single burden, but several. One man carried the receiver, the heaviest single piece. Another carried the barrel. Another carried the tripod, itself over 40 pounds, and someone had to bring the ammunition, which in half-inch belts is heavy in its own right, a few hundred rounds enough to strain a man's back. Setting the gun up meant assembling those pieces in the right order, mounting the receiver on the tripod, running the barrel home and setting its headspace, loading the belt, and checking the timing, all before the first round could be fired with confidence. A rifle came into action the moment a man raised it. The half-inch gun came into action at the end of a drill. For all its danger, the ritual bred a strange confidence in the men who mastered it. A gunner who could set headspace and timing by feel, check them with the gauge, and bring the weapon into action correctly trusted the gun completely, because he knew it had been made right. The procedure that could injure a careless crew rewarded a careful one with a weapon that ran and ran. That is part of why soldiers spoke of the gun with respect rather than fear. The hazard was real, but it was a known hazard, drilled and gauged and placed under the crew's control, not a random failure waiting in the mechanism. A man who did the drill lived with the danger the way any skilled worker lives with a powerful tool. The setup that outsiders saw as a flaw, the crews saw as the price of a gun they could depend on. The danger and the dependability came from the same adjustable joint, and the crews accepted the first to have the second. The trade in that ritual was stark. Manual headspace and timing let a single design digest ammunition from an entire wartime industry of uneven output, which was exactly what a weapon built by the million from many suppliers required. In exchange, it placed a lethal maintenance step between the gunner and the trigger, and it demanded a crew trained to perform it. The advantage was universal ammunition compatibility. The cost was a gun that could injure the man who set it up wrong, and a weapon that could never be a one-man affair. The strange resolution came only at the end of the story, and it is worth marking now. Not until the upgrade of 2010 would the gun finally be given fixed headspace and timing, removing the adjustment, the gauge, and the danger in one design change. For most of a century, the ritual stood. It was accepted as the price of a gun that could be built anywhere and fed anything. And feeding anything was not an accident of the design. Uneven ammunition from dozens of makers was not a flaw the plan tolerated. It was the plan, because the plan was to build the gun everywhere at once. Chapter 6. The factories that built 2 million 50s. Colt could design the half-inch Browning. Colt could not come close to building enough of them. Almost no single company could have, once the Second World War set the scale of what was needed. The answer was to build the gun everywhere at once, across an industrial base that had spent the previous decade making anything but weapons. The weapon that emerged from that effort was a gun designed by one company and manufactured by an economy. The numbers describe an output that dwarfed the requirement that started it. Across the war years, American industry produced close to 2 million half-inch guns of all models, the aircraft guns and the ground guns and the anti-aircraft guns together. Of those, the heavy barrel ground gun accounted for something on the order of 350,000. A requirement written for a handful of specialized anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons had become one of the largest weapons programs of the war, measured in the millions. The gap the gun was meant to fill turned out to run through the entire war, on the ground, in vehicles, and in the air, and the factories answered the whole of it. Most of those 2 million were aircraft guns, because a single fighter swallowed 6 or 8 of them, and a bomber more still, and the air war consumed guns at a rate the ground war never approached. The makers were not, for the most part, gun makers. When the war demanded guns by the million, the divisions of America's largest manufacturers turned their lines to the work. Among the plants that built the half-inch Browning were the automotive and appliance divisions of General Motors, ACK Spark Plug, better known for engine components, Frigidaire, a maker of refrigerators, and Guidelamp, a maker of automotive lighting. A line that had built cooling units for kitchens learned to build and gauge machine gun receivers. The transformation was possible because the gun had been designed, through Green's single receiver work, to be manufactured as a system, and because the war effort spread the necessary tooling and knowledge across firms that had never touched small arms. There was a fitting logic in who built the gun. A company that made spark plugs already worked metal to close tolerances in huge numbers. A company that made refrigerators already ran assembly lines and understood how to hold a standard across thousands of identical units. The skills of mass production, precise machining, gauging, and assembly at scale were exactly the skills the gun demanded, and the great manufacturers of peacetime goods had spent decades perfecting them. The war did not ask a refrigerator plant to become a gunsmith's shop. It asked a mass producer to mass produce something new. And the half-inch Browning, designed as a system of interchangeable parts, was built to be produced that way. That approach only worked on a foundation of interchangeability. A gun assembled from parts made in a dozen different plants demands that a bolt from one factory fit a receiver from another, that a barrel made in one state headspace correctly in a gun assembled in another. Holding that standard across firms new to the work was the hardest part of the whole enterprise. The stakes of a slipped tolerance were not evenly distributed through the process. An error caught early, at the machining of a single part, cost that one part. The same error caught late, after assembly and inspection, could stop a shipment and idle the labor already invested in it. Quality control was not a finishing step. It was the thing that made distributed production possible at all. Interchangeability was also what made the gun serviceable in the field. A weapon whose parts were built to a common standard could be repaired with parts from any other, so a damaged gun could be brought back to life with a bolt or a barrel drawn from stores rather than sent to a depot. The same discipline that let a dozen factories build one gun let a single armorer keep 100 guns running. Precision on the factory floor became reliability in the mud, because a part that fit everywhere could replace a part that had failed anywhere. The fight for tolerances was not bureaucratic fussiness. It was the reason the gun could be both mass-produced and mass-maintained. The people who did the work were, in enormous numbers, civilians who had never built a weapon before the war and would not after it. A worker who had assembled refrigerators the year before now gauged the receivers of a heavy machine gun, holding tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch on a weapon that would fire a half-inch round across a battlefield. The gun that a Marine would fire from a tripod, and that a pilot would fire from a wing, passed first through the hands of factory workers on appliance and car parts lines, whose care with a gauge determined whether the weapon worked when it mattered. The reliability the gun earned in the field was built into it on those lines, one gauged part at a time, by people who would never see it fired. Inspection was the invisible half of the effort. For every gauge a worker ran on a part in progress, an inspector ran another on the finished piece, because a distributed production system stands or falls on catching the bad part before it ships. Barrels were checked for bore and chamber, receivers for the critical dimensions that governed headspace, bolts and locking blocks for the fit that made the action safe. A part that passed traveled onward toward assembly. A part that failed was pulled before it could reach a gun and, from there, a soldier. The whole enormous output rested on that unglamorous work. Thousands of measurements a day across dozens of plants, each one a small guard against a weapon that jammed or a headspace that would not set. The soldiers who trusted the gun never met the inspectors who earned that trust. They only knew that the weapon worked, which was exactly what the gauging was for. The reach of the design ran beyond American borders even before the war. In Belgium, the firm of Fabrique Nationale had been manufacturing the Browning since the 1930s, and the gun's presence in foreign arsenals would become a major part of its later life. But the wartime story is above all an American industrial one, a weapon designed to be built as a system, produced by companies chosen for their capacity rather than their history with firearms, held to an interchangeability standard that let a national economy function as a single armory. When the war ended, that vast output did not vanish. It became the seed of the gun's long afterlife. Hundreds of thousands of weapons in stores, ready to be issued, sold, or handed to allies for decades to come. The trade in that strategy was written into every gun. Spreading production across appliance and car parts plants delivered oceans of weapons at a speed no traditional arms industry could have matched. In exchange, interchangeability demanded tolerances those plants had never been asked to hold. And every tolerance that slipped came back somewhere downrange as a jam, a stoppage, or a headspace that would not set. The advantage was quantity at unprecedented scale. The cost was a constant, unforgiving fight for precision across firms that had built kitchen appliances a year before. That fight was largely won, and 2 million guns had to go somewhere. The first and largest place was not the ground at all. It was the sky the gun had been born to rule. Chapter 7. 8 guns in a wing. The half-inch Browning was conceived to kill aircraft. In the Second World War, it finally got its war in the air, and it got there by flying. The requirement of 1918 had imagined the gun on the ground, firing upward at armored planes. The war that used it in the greatest numbers turned that arrangement around. The gun went up into the aircraft itself and fired outward, and in that role it became the standard armament of American air power. The aircraft version was a different weapon in weight and speed, though the same in design. Stripped to its lightest form, the aircraft gun weighed around 60 pounds, far less than the heavy ground gun, because it did not need a heavy barrel to shed heat through the airstream that cooled it in flight, and because it fired in bursts rather than sustained fire. It ran faster, too, at a cyclic rate in the range of 750 to 850 rounds a minute. That combination, lighter and faster, made it the standard half-inch aviation gun of the war, the weapon that armed the fighters whose names defined American air combat. The fighters carried it in numbers. The Mustang carried 6 of the guns, 3 in each wing. The Thunderbolt carried 8, 4 to a side, a weight of fire that could saw through an enemy machine in a short burst. The Lightning gathered its guns in the nose around a cannon, so that its fire flew straight rather than converging, and struck with concentrated force at any range the pilot chose. Heavy bombers carried more still, ringed with the guns in nose, tail, top, belly, and waist positions, some with a dozen or more, so that a formation of them threw up an interlocking net of half-inch fire in every direction. Where a single ground gunner served one weapon, a fighter pilot commanded 6 or 8 with one trigger, and a bomber crew fought behind a wall of them. The pilot's experience of the gun was unlike the gunner's. He did not set headspace and timing, or serve the weapon by hand. He aimed the entire aircraft, lined the target in his sight, and pressed a trigger that fired the whole battery. The recoil of 6 or 8 guns firing together was enough to be felt through the airframe, a shudder that slowed the aircraft slightly as the guns ran. On the wing-mounted fighters, the guns were harmonized, angled so that their separate streams converged at a chosen distance ahead, so that a target caught at that range met the concentrated fire of the entire battery at once. A brief press of the trigger sent hundreds of half-inch rounds toward a single point in the sky. What those rounds carried mattered as much as how many there were. The belts were loaded in a deliberate mix: armor-piercing rounds to bite through an enemy's protection, incendiary rounds to set fuel and structure alight, tracer rounds to show the pilot where his fire was going, and rounds that combined armor-piercing and incendiary effect in a single bullet. A burst was not a stream of identical shots, but a woven pattern of effects, arriving together. The tracer let the pilot walk his fire onto the target by eye. The armor-piercing and incendiary rounds did the killing, punching into an engine or a tank and igniting what they found. That mix is part of why a few seconds of fire from a fighter's battery could be decisive against a machine that a plain solid bullet might only have holed. The bomber crews knew the gun from the defensive side, firing outward from cramped positions as enemy fighters bored in. A tail gunner sat alone at the very back of the aircraft, behind a pair of the guns, the last line against an attack from astern. A ball turret gunner curled into a sphere beneath the fuselage, turning with his 2 guns to meet fighters coming up from below. A waist gunner braced against the slipstream at an open window, swinging a single gun onto targets that flashed past. Each of them fired the same half-inch weapon the fighters carried, but from a position of defense rather than attack, trying to break up an enemy pass before it could rake the bomber. The deep belts fed them enough rounds to keep firing through a long engagement, and the reach of the gun let them open fire before the fighter was close enough to be sure of its aim. It was hard, cold, frightening work, done at altitude in thin air, and the gun in those positions was less a weapon of conquest than a means of survival, a way to make an attacker weigh the price of the pass. The gun's record in the air is genuine, and it deserves a measure of restraint about how it is remembered. It is sometimes described as the weapon that won the air war, and it was decisive in the hands of the aircraft that carried it. But it shared the sky with enemies armed differently, and it did so for a reason. Against a nimble fighter, a battery of fast half-inch guns was punishing. Against a large, heavily built bomber of the kind the gun's opponent sometimes had to face, a cannon firing explosive shells could do in a few hits what the half-inch gun did in many. The American choice of many fast machine guns over fewer cannon was a real doctrine with real advantages, but it was a choice among trade-offs, not a simple case of the best gun winning. Other air forces made the opposite choice and mounted cannon, and they had their reasons too. Those trade-offs were physical. A battery of 6 or 8 guns gave a pilot overwhelming volume of fire and long reach, more chances to hit a fast target in the fraction of a second it stayed in his sight, and belts deep enough to keep firing through a long fight. Each of those guns, with its ammunition, was also weight and drag on the aircraft, and the half-inch bullet, powerful as it was against a fighter, was marginal against a target a cannon shell could open in a stroke. The advantage was volume, reach, and endurance. The cost was the weight of the battery, and around that, against the heaviest targets, had to strike many times to do a cannon's work. The gun that ruled the sky as a fighter's weapon was, at the same time, revealing the outer edge of what a machine gun could do against the toughest things that flew. On the ground, the gun escaped its assignment in the opposite direction. Instead of one gun multiplied into a fighter's battery aimed at aircraft, 4 guns were bolted together on a single mount and aimed, in the end, not at planes at all, but at men. Chapter 8. The Meat Chopper. The Army built the quad mount to defend against aircraft. Its soldiers found another use for 2,000 rounds a minute. The mount was designated the Meters 45, built by the Maxson Company and introduced in 1944 to replace an earlier twin arrangement. It carried 4 heavy barrel guns together, paired on either side of an armored seat for a single gunner, each gun fed from its own supply of around 200 rounds. One man, turning with the mount, controlled the combined output of 4 half-inch guns firing together, well over 2,000 rounds a minute when all 4 ran. The mount was a machine in its own right, not merely 4 guns on a frame. It carried its own electric power to traverse and elevate, so the gunner could swing the heavy battery quickly by hand controls rather than muscle alone, tracking a moving target across the sky. It could be set on a trailer for towing, mounted on a half-track to move with an armored column, or emplaced to guard a fixed point. The armored seat gave the gunner some protection as he sat between the barrels. Everything about the arrangement was built for one purpose: to put the fire of 4 guns onto a fast-moving aircraft, and to move that fire fast enough to follow the target. Its designed purpose was air defense on the move. As the principal anti-aircraft weapon of mobile artillery units in Europe, the quad mount traveled with the columns and threw up a wall of fire against aircraft that came down to strafe. 4 guns tuned to converge their fire on a single point could put an overwhelming density of rounds where an attacking plane would be, and the mere presence of the weapon deterred low-level attacks that would otherwise have savaged troops in the open. In that role, it did useful work, guarding the sky over moving formations that had no other quick answer to a diving aircraft. Its designed purpose also revealed its limits. Tested against the fast-diving suicide aircraft that appeared toward the end of the war, in 1945, the mount proved too light for the task. The guns and their mount could traverse quickly, but they lacked the weight and the hitting power to reliably stop an aircraft coming down at high speed with the intent to crash home. Against a fast, committed dive, the wall of half-inch fire was not always enough. The weapon that guarded against strafing runs found the edge of its usefulness when the target stopped trying to survive and simply aimed itself at the guns. A strafing pilot wanted to hit and escape, and the threat of 4 guns turned him away. A pilot who meant to die on the target could not be deterred, only destroyed. And destroying him before he arrived asked more than the mount could reliably give. What the mount could do without limit was cut down men. When it was turned on ground targets, its effect was immediate and total, and the soldiers who used it gave it names that recorded what they saw. They called it the meat chopper. They called it the kraut mower. 4 guns firing together at troops in the open produced a result that the anti-aircraft designation on paper never described. As the wars went on, that became its real work. In Korea, a later version of the quad mount saw extensive ground use, turned on massed infantry assaults where its density of fire could break an attack that came on in numbers. In Vietnam, the weapon was pressed into service again, defending bases and riding escort on convoys, where 4 guns could answer an ambush with a volume of fire nothing on the roadside could withstand. A mount, conceived to point at the sky, spent its most infamous service pointed at the ground. The quad mount rarely traveled alone. It was often bolted into a half-track, an armored vehicle with wheels in front and tracks behind, so that the 4 guns could keep pace with a moving column and defend it on the march. Mounted that way, the weapon became a mobile fortress of fire, rolling with the tanks and trucks and ready to throw its wall upward the moment aircraft appeared. The arrangement had a cost that showed under heavy use. 4 guns firing together heated 4 barrels together, and barrels fired hard enough, long enough, had to be changed, which on the old guns meant the dangerous, deliberate work of swapping a hot barrel and resetting its headspace 4 times over. A mount that could pour out fire faster than any single gun also wore out faster and demanded more maintenance, more ammunition, and more spare barrels than a single weapon ever asked. The density that made it terrible was the same density that made it hungry. Here, the popular memory needs a light correction. The quad mount is often filed simply as an anti-aircraft weapon, a wartime air defense tool. That claim requires restraint. Its designers built it to kill aircraft, and against strafing runs it earned its place. But the record shows its longest and most consequential service was against men on the ground, in Korea and Vietnam, years after the aircraft threat it was built for had faded. The weapon is remembered for the job it was assigned and used for the job it turned out to do best, and those were not the same job. The gunner in the armored seat experienced a weapon of extraordinary density. He sat between the paired guns, traversing the whole mount with its 4 barrels toward a target, and when he fired, 4 streams of half-inch rounds went out together. Against a massed ground attack at close range, at night, on a perimeter under pressure, the effect was a volume of fire that a single gun could not approach. The nicknames were not bravado, they were description. The trade in the quad mount was the trade of concentration. 4 converging barrels delivered annihilating firepower at close range, more than enough to break an assault or clear a slope. In exchange, 4 guns burned ammunition and barrels at a rate that strained any supply system, consuming in minutes what a single gun consumed in a long fight. and the lightness that let the mount traverse fast toward a low aircraft was the same lightness that made it too weak to reliably stop the fastest of them. The advantage was overwhelming close-range density. The cost was a ravenous appetite for ammunition and barrels, and a mount too light for the high-speed aircraft it was built to kill. That failure against fast aircraft was not a fluke of one bad test. The whole sky was moving out of the gun's reach. Chapter 9. The targets outran it. The half-inch Browning was built to kill two things. By the end of its first Great War, both were slipping away. The gun had been designed against the armored aircraft and the tank of 1918, and it had been built in the millions in time for the war of the 1940s. But the aircraft and the tank did not stand still. Across the same years the gun reached its peak of production, both of its designed targets evolved past the point where a half-inch machine gun could reliably answer them. The weapon was arriving at full strength just as its two original jobs were being taken away. In the air, speed was the thief. The piston-engine fighters the gun was built to fight and to arm gave way to jets, and a jet crossed a gunner's field of fire faster than the guns could track and lead it. The problem was one of time. To bring a target down, a gun must put enough rounds into it, and to do that, it must hold on the target long enough for those rounds to arrive. A jet moving half again or twice as fast as a piston fighter stayed in a gunner's sight for a shorter time and demanded a greater lead. And in that shrinking window, a gun firing a few hundred rounds a minute could place only a handful of rounds where they were needed. The math that had favored the gun against slower aircraft turned against it as speeds climbed. The response was to make the gun fire faster still. A wartime development pushed the aircraft gun's cyclic rate to around 1,200 rounds a minute, nearly double the standard aircraft gun, in an effort to put enough rounds in the air in the shrinking instant a jet stayed in the sight. That faster gun armed the early jet fighters, the swept-wing machines of the first jet versus jet war, and it served as defensive armament in the tails of heavy bombers for decades, riding the largest of them as late as 1980. Even that had a ceiling. Doubling the rate bought more rounds in the window, but it could not stop the window from shrinking, and it burned barrels and ammunition twice as fast to buy the gain. The future of air combat belonged to cannon, and then to missiles, weapons that answered speed with explosive power and guidance rather than with volume of machine gun fire. On the ground, thickness was the thief. The gun had been required, in 1918, to pierce about an inch of armor at 250 yards, and against the tanks of that era, an inch of penetration meant something. The tanks of the Second World War wore armor measured in multiples of that, hardened and sloped to turn a striking round aside, far beyond what a half-inch bullet could defeat. The anti-tank role passed to dedicated weapons. High-velocity cannon that fired a far larger armor-piercing shot, shaped charge rockets that burned through plate with a jet of metal, and purpose-built guns that could deliver the energy a machine gun never could. The half-inch Browning could still tear through light vehicles, thin-skinned transport, and the flanks of lightly protected machines. Against a modern tank's frontal armor, it was no longer the answer, and it had not been for years. The gunner on the ground felt the change as a problem of leading a target he could not catch. A crew trained to track aircraft found that the newest aircraft simply moved too fast to hold in the sight for the time a burst needed to reach them. The weapon that had been built to reach up and pull down the machines in the sky was watching those machines pass beyond its reach, faster every year. The same was true, in its way, of the armor rolling across the ground. The gun that had been specified to defeat armor plate was firing at tanks it could no longer open, its rounds sparking off a glacis built to shrug them away. The end of the gun's air defense life came not from a better gun, but from a different kind of weapon entirely. As jets grew faster still, the answer to an aircraft became the guided missile, a weapon that did not need to predict where a target would be and fill that space with rounds, but instead flew toward the target and corrected as it went. A missile could reach speeds and altitudes no machine gun bullet could follow, and it carried a warhead that did not need a direct hit to destroy. Against that, the half-inch anti-aircraft gun had nothing left to offer, and it quietly left the role it had been born for. On the ground, the same displacement had already happened with armor. The shaped charge rocket a single soldier could carry, and the recoilless gun a small crew could serve, gave infantry a way to kill tanks that the half-inch gun had long since lost. Both of the gun's original jobs now belonged to weapons built specifically for them, and the gun that had once claimed both was left holding neither. Here the record asks for restraint against a fond memory. The half-inch Browning is sometimes remembered as a great anti-tank gun, and against the armor of the First World War era it was exactly that. But it defeated the armor of 1918, not the armor of 1945. Its armor-piercing reputation, real at its birth, outlived the relevance of that reputation by decades. Popular retellings compress the timeline and let the early promise stand in for the gun's whole career against armor, remembering the requirement and forgetting how fast the target grew past it. The record shows a weapon whose anti-tank value faded as tanks grew, even as the gun itself kept serving in other roles. The trade the gun faced in chasing its fleeing targets was the trade of rate against endurance. It could be tuned to fire faster, and faster fire meant more rounds in the brief window a fast aircraft offered. But every increase in rate of fire burned barrels and consumed ammunition harder, and no rate of fire could make a bullet that traveled a half-mile every second catch a jet or crack a heavy tank's frontal plate. The advantage a faster gun bought was a few more rounds on a fast target. The cost was barrels worn out sooner and ammunition spent faster, in pursuit of targets that were leaving its reach regardless. A weapon that has lost both of its jobs should, by any ordinary logic, disappear. This one did the opposite. It found a third job that no other weapon did as well. Chapter 10. A mile and a half of reach. Stripped of the sky and the tank, the half-inch Browning became something its designers never specified. It became a precision weapon. The gun had been built for volume against machines, hundreds of rounds a minute thrown at aircraft and armor. Its longest afterlife began when soldiers discovered that the same qualities that made it a machine killer, its reach, its flat trajectory, and the energy it carried far downrange, made it capable of something a machine gun was not meant to do: strike a single point at a distance no rifle could match. The insight followed from the numbers. A bullet that could travel more than 4 miles and stay lethal for much of that flight carried its energy far past the range where a rifle bullet had faded. At a mile, a rifle round had spent most of its speed and drifted with the wind, but the heavy half-inch bullet was still moving fast and flying flat, holding a course a marksman could predict. The gun had been built to reach aircraft at those distances with a hail of rounds. Fired one shot at a time, from a stable mount, by a man who understood the trajectory, it could reach a single target at those distances instead. The reach was always there. What was new was the idea of using it one round at a time. In Vietnam, the gun did its expected work and more. It defended fixed bases, and it rode escort on the convoys that moved along the country's exposed roads, where its range and destructive power against vehicles and structures made it the heaviest answer a truck column could carry. But the use that entered the record most sharply was different. A Marine, using a half-inch gun fitted with a telescopic sight, turned the weapon into a long-range precision instrument. Carlos Hathcock mounted a scope on the gun and set it to fire a single shot at a time. And he used it to engage targets at ranges far beyond what any shoulder rifle of the day could reach, striking at distances around 2,500 yards, close to a mile and a half. The feat set a mark for long-range killing that would stand for decades, into the early 2000s. That single application changed how armies thought about the half-inch round. The idea that a scoped heavy machine gun, fired in single shots, could reach an individual target at more than a mile pointed toward a whole class of weapons that came later. The anti-material rifles that followed, shoulder-fired weapons chambered for the same half-inch cartridge, were built to do deliberately what Hathcock had improvised, to place a single heavy bullet on a distant target with precision. With them came specialized ammunition designed to make one round count, a saboted round that shed a lightweight sleeve at the muzzle and drove a smaller, faster dart of tungsten through armor, and a multi-purpose round that combined armor-piercing, incendiary, and explosive effect in a single bullet so that one hit could pierce a light vehicle and destroy what was inside it. The reach that had been a byproduct of an anti-aircraft requirement became, in the second half of the gun's life, its defining virtue. A weapon built to hose the sky had become the longest arm on the battlefield. What began as one Marine's improvisation became, in time, a category of standard equipment. Armies that saw what a scoped half-inch weapon could do commissioned rifles, built for the purpose, shoulder-fired and precise, chambered for the same cartridge that had reached across Vietnam. By the time of the Desert Wars, at the century's turn, those anti-material rifles were issued tools, carried to reach across open ground and destroy equipment a rifle could not touch: a parked vehicle, a radio, a weapon on its mount, a device left by a road. The single heavy bullet that Hathcock had sent across a valley had become a doctrine, a recognized way to reach a valuable target at a distance that kept the shooter safe. The reach the gun had always possessed, once a byproduct of an anti-aircraft requirement, was now the reason for a whole family of weapons. The machine gun had taught the rifle a new trick, and the trick was distance. Two myths cluster around this stretch of the gun's story, and both deserve correction. The first is the belief that it is illegal to fire the half-inch gun at an enemy soldier, that some rule of war permits shooting only at equipment, at a man's pack or canteen rather than the man. That claim requires restraint, and then rejection, because it is false. A weapon is unlawful under the laws of war when it causes suffering out of proportion to any military purpose, and the half-inch gun appears on no list of prohibited arms. The myth appears to trace to the Vietnam era, where orders to conserve heavy ammunition for worthwhile targets, vehicles, and materiel rather than individuals hardened over time into a rumored rule of law. A practical instruction about ammunition became, in the retelling, a prohibition that never existed. The record is plain, and the long-range precision use makes it plainer. The weapon was used against personnel at extreme range, deliberately and lawfully, and some of the longest recorded kills in the history of war were made with it against men, not their equipment. The second myth is subtler, and it touches the very record just described. The exact distance of the most famous long-range shot and the details around it are not accepted by every source without question, and some accounts dispute the specifics. That, too, calls for restraint. The safe statement is the modest one. A scoped half-inch gun was used to kill at ranges no contemporary rifle could reach. The feat was real and repeated by others, and it established the half-inch cartridge as a long-range precision round. Where a single figure is contested, the honest course is to report the range as approximate and let the larger, well-supported facts stand. The gun reached targets a mile and more away, and armies took the lesson seriously enough to build new weapons around it. The trade in that reach was the old trade, unchanged since 1918. The gun could touch what nothing else could touch, a target at a mile and a half that no rifleman could answer. That reach lived inside a system near 128 pounds, gun and tripod together, that had to be carried to its position, set up, crewed, and adjusted. The man with the longest reach on the battlefield was also, at that moment, the least mobile. The advantage was a distance no other weapon in the infantry's hands could match. The cost was everything it took to bring that weight into action and hold it there. And reach that nothing else offered is precisely why the gun refused to retire and why every attempt to replace it failed. Chapter 11. The gun that would not be replaced. For decade after decade, armies tried to build the half-inch Browning's successor. For decade after decade, they kept issuing the half-inch Browning. The gun that had lost both of its original jobs, and found a third, settled into a role it has never surrendered. The standard heavy weapon of vehicles, ships, and fixed positions, the heaviest gun a small unit routinely carries into a fight. Through the Gulf War, through Iraq, through Afghanistan, the same basic weapon that had ridden the half-tracks of the Second World War rode the turrets of modern gun trucks, doing work no lighter weapon could do. Its modern role is the anti-material role, the destruction of things rather than the defeat of armor. Mounted on a vehicle, the gun answers other vehicles, thin-skinned transport, boats, structures, and fortified positions, delivering across a mile the kind of destructive force that a rifle cannot. A crew-served half-inch gun on a truck can reach out and stop a vehicle, punch through a wall a rifle round would only chip, and hold ground at a range that keeps threats at a distance. The specialized ammunition that grew out of the precision role extended that reach and lethality further, giving a single round the power to pierce and to burn, so that even one hit on a valuable target could be decisive. The gun that could no longer crack a tank found more than enough to do against everything a tank was not. The gun's presence spread far beyond the army that designed it. Built in the millions and left in stores by the hundreds of thousands after the war, it was handed to allies, sold as surplus, and licensed to foreign makers until it became one of the most widely fielded heavy weapons on Earth. It armed the vehicles and ships of allied nations across the world, mounted on everything from patrol boats to armored cars, and it was manufactured under license in several countries, so that guns leaving factories in Belgium, Britain, and the United States all traced to the same design. A weapon that began as an American answer to an American requirement became a common standard shared across alliances, familiar to soldiers who had never heard the names Browning or Green. The efforts to replace it are a study in why it endured. The armies that fielded the gun understood its age and its weight, and they repeatedly set out to build something better. They designed lighter heavy machine guns, meant to deliver the same fire at less than half the weight. They designed guns that fired smart, programmable rounds timed to burst above a target and rain fragments down. They looked at new cartridges between the rifle and the half-inch, hoping to reach nearly as far for much less mass. Those programs came and went. Some were canceled before they fielded. Some worked as designed and still did not displace the older gun, because the improvement they offered did not outweigh the cost and risk of retiring a weapon that already did its job, that every soldier already knew, and that already existed in every arsenal by the 100,000. The half-inch Browning survived not because no one tried to replace it, but because every replacement had to beat a gun that was very hard to beat. The reason it was hard to beat is simple to state. Nothing lighter delivered the same combination of range and terminal effect. A weapon that weighed less gave up reach or power. A weapon that matched the reach and power weighed as much. The physics that made the gun heavy in 1918, a large bullet driven fast, were the same physics that made it effective, and no material or mechanism had changed those physics enough to offer the effect without the weight. A lighter gun firing the same cartridge still had to contain the same pressure and absorb the same recoil, and a gun firing a smaller cartridge gave up the reach that was the whole point. The gun endured because the need it met was permanent, and because the trade-offs it embodied were not the result of an old design, but of the nature of the task. The soldier behind it, a turret gunner on a convoy from the Gulf to Kandahar, served a weapon whose fundamentals his great-grandfather could have serviced. The controls, the belt, The headspace ritual on the older guns, the short recoil cycle, all of it descended directly from the design of the 1930s. He might have fired it from a ring mount on an armored truck, from a remote station he aimed through a screen, or from a naval mount guarding a ship against small boats, but the gun under all those fittings was the same gun. A weapon whose lineage ran back to a First World War requirement was, in the 21st century, still the standard heavy gun of a modern army. Still the thing a unit reached for when a rifle was not enough and a cannon was too much. There was a quieter argument for the gun that had nothing to do with the weapon itself. An army that had fielded the half-inch Browning for generations had built everything around it. The belts and the links, the ammunition by the millions of rounds, the mounts on every vehicle, the training courses, the manuals, the spare parts, the muscle memory of countless soldiers. Replacing the gun meant replacing all of that, a cost far larger than the price of a new weapon, and accepting the risk that the new gun would carry unknown faults the old one had long since shed. Keeping the gun kept the whole system that surrounded it, proven and paid for. That is the hidden weight behind every decision to retain it. The weapon was not merely a gun that worked. It was the center of an entire established way of arming and supplying a force, and moving away from it would have meant moving all of that at once, for a gain that never quite justified the upheaval. The trade in keeping the gun was a trade of risk against age. Retaining the proven weapon spared armies decades of development cost, and gave every soldier a gun their predecessors could have understood, reliable, familiar, and cheap to keep because it already existed by the 100,000. In exchange, it bound the force to a 128-pound system and, for most of that time, a manual headspace ritual, long after both looked like relics of another century. The advantage was proven capability at no development risk. The cost was carrying an antique's weight and quirks into modern war. The one thing the armies could do, since they could not replace the gun, was finally to fix it. Chapter 12. Fixing a 100-year-old gun. They could not build a better gun than the half-inch Browning. So in 2010, they rebuilt the half-inch Browning itself. After nearly 8 decades of frontline service and a long line of abandoned replacements, the decision was not to design something new, but to correct the 2 oldest complaints against the existing gun: the danger of its setup and the hazard of changing its barrel. The result was type classified on the 15th of October, 2010, and it addressed the gun's inherited flaws directly. The upgrade centered on the barrel and the setup ritual. The new version carried a quick change barrel, one that could be removed and replaced quickly by means of a handle, without the old procedure and without the danger that had accompanied barrel changes on the original gun. More significant still, it fixed the headspace and timing, building the correct settings into the weapon so that the crew no longer had to set them by hand. The single most dangerous task in operating the gun, the manual adjustment that could fire a round out of battery, was engineered out of existence. Alongside those changes came a flash suppressor that cut the gun's muzzle flash by about 95%, hiding the weapon's position from an enemy who would otherwise see it fire, and a manual safety, a trigger block, of a kind the original design had never included. Each of those changes answered a specific lesson written over decades of use. The quick change barrel answered the fact that a gun firing sustained bursts heats its barrel toward ruin, and that the old design made swapping a hot barrel slow and dangerous work. The fixed headspace answered every gunner who had ever risked an out-of-battery detonation setting the gun up under stress. The flash suppressor answered the reality that a gun's muzzle flash gives its position away, and that a hidden gun lives longer. The safety answered the plain fact that a weapon without one is more dangerous to its own side. None of these was a redesign of how the gun worked. Each was a fix to how the gun was used, drawn from the accumulated experience of the men who had used it. The scale of the conversion matched the scale of the gun's presence in the force. Beginning in 2011, the Army set about converting its existing heavy barrel guns to the new standard, and the program reached across the inventory, upgrading tens of thousands of weapons, more than 50,000 in the Army's effort, with thousands fielded in the first years. Other forces followed with their own improved versions of the same weapon, adopting quick change barrel guns built to the same idea. The gun was not being phased out, it was being renewed in numbers that only made sense for a weapon expected to serve for many more years. A design from before the Second World War was being modernized for service in a century its inventor never saw. The armorer who changed a barrel on the new gun performed in seconds, safely, a task that on the older gun had carried real risk. The barrel came off by its handle, a new one went on, and the fixed headspace meant there was no gauge to run, no adjustment to judge, no chance to fire out of battery through a setting made wrong under stress. The ritual that had defined the gun for generations of gunners, the 2 words every crew learned first, was reduced to a handle and a click. The gun had been made to do what it always did, without the danger it always carried. The 2-man crew and the weight remained, because those came from the cartridge and could not be engineered away, but the deadliest quirk of the weapon was gone. The last myth to correct is the gentlest one, and the modernization is what corrects it. The half-inch Browning is described as a gun unchanged for 100 years, and from a distance the silhouette supports the claim. The outline of the modern gun is nearly the outline of the 1930s gun, but the claim requires restraint, because the two things about the weapon that most needed to change are exactly the things that changed. The barrel that once had to be handled carefully now changes in seconds. The headspace that once could kill a gunner is now fixed. The gun looks unchanged and is not, precisely where it mattered most. The continuity is real in form, and the change is real in function, and both are true at once. The myth felt true because the shape never changed. The record shows that the dangers did. By the time the modernized gun entered service, the weapon had passed a mark few designs ever reach. Its cartridge and its basic mechanism traced back to the last months of the First World War, and its mature form to the early 1930s, which meant the gun was still arming frontline forces roughly a century after the requirement that created it. Foreign forces adopted the improved version alongside the American one, ordering quick-change barrel guns of their own, so that the modernized weapons spread through Allied arsenals as the original had. A design that predated radar, the jet engine, and the guided missile was being bought new, upgraded, and issued in a world full of all three. The gun had outlasted not only its own designers, but whole generations of the weapons meant to replace it, and it entered its second century not as a museum piece kept on for sentiment, but as standard equipment, chosen again because nothing better had been found. The verdict on the weapon is written in that last upgrade. Fixing the gun rather than replacing it removed its deadliest quirk and its slowest chore, and every dollar spent on the fix was another confirmation that no clean-sheet successor was worth building. The improvement bound the future to a century-old core, and it did so deliberately, because the core was sound. The advantage of the upgrade was a safer, faster gun with all the old reach and power intact. The cost was the admission, permanent now, that the best heavy machine gun available was still, at heart, the one designed before the Second World War. The gun that lost both of its original jobs is the one gun the United States has never been able to put down. It began with a bullet that could reach what the rifle could not. In the last weeks of the First World War, an army that could not touch the armored aircraft or the tank with its rifle-caliber guns asked for a larger one, a half-inch bullet driven at least 2,700 feet per second, powerful enough to pierce the armor the smaller round turned aside. That requirement outran the war that created it. The gun to fire it was not ready when the armistice came, and the cartridge did not meet its own standard until a captured enemy round showed the way. The weapon that resulted took 15 years and a designer's death to reach its mature form, arriving as a family of guns built from a single receiver, ready at last for a war that would use it by the million. The industry that built it turned refrigerator and car parts plants into armories, holding tolerances they had never held, and produced close to 2 million guns of every model. Those guns went first into the air, 6 and 8 to a fighter's wing, and ruled the sky the gun had been born to rule, though they shared it with cannon for reasons the heaviest targets made plain. On the ground, 4 guns bolted together became the meat chopper, a weapon built against aircraft that did its worst work against men. And in the same years the gun reached its height, both of its designed targets slipped away. Aircraft grew too fast to catch. Tanks grew too thick to pierce. The 2 jobs the gun was built for were taken by other weapons within a single generation. The gun did not follow its jobs into retirement. It found a third role its designers never named, the reach role. The long arm that could strike a vehicle, a wall, a boat, or a man at 1.5 miles, a distance no rifle could answer. That role made it indispensable, and it made every attempt to replace the gun fail, because nothing lighter delivered the same reach and the same destructive force, and nothing that matched them weighed any less. So the armies kept the gun. When they could not better it, they fixed it, engineering out the deadly headspace ritual and the dangerous barrel change, and renewing tens of thousands of weapons for a service life stretching past 100 years from the requirement that started it. How does a weapon built to kill one thing survive by killing everything else? By occupying a space that never closes. The rifle handles the man, and the cannon handles the fortress, and between them lies the truck, the bunker, the boat, the gun position at a range no rifleman can reach and no cannon is worth spending on. The half-inch Browning was built for a narrow part of that middle ground, the aircraft and the tank, and it inherited the whole of it. It survived because the middle ground is permanent, and because the trade it embodied, unmatched reach and power bought with weight and a crew, was never a flaw in an old design but a law of the task itself. The Army built it to kill the airplane and the tank. History handed it everything in between, and it is still firing.